Good morning and welcome to this interview as part of Cambridgeshire Music's Women in Music feature. Today I'm joined by Sarah MacDonald. Thank you for joining me today, Sarah. Sarah is a Fellow and Director of Music at Selwyn College in Cambridge and Director of Ely Cathedral's Girl Choristers, as well as an organist, composer and writer. So my first question for you, Sarah, what does it mean to you personally to be a woman in music, and how does this interact with other aspects of your identity?
Well, I've been thinking about this question for a couple of days in the hopes that I would come up with a brilliant answer. Most of the time, if I'm perfectly honest, I don't think about my sex/gender either. I simply am a musician, and my entire being is about being a musician, and I don't really think about the other side of things, I guess. I suppose every once in a while I notice it, because particularly in the two places I work, I'm pretty much outnumbered. And I look around the room in meetings of directors of music and realise there are hardly any women, and they're mostly men, or certainly in the cathedral world, most of the directors of music in the country are men. And I notice it then, but again, I think more of what I am is about music, and in a sense, everything else is irrelevant.
Thank you.
May not be the answer you're looking for, but that's what I could come up with.
No, I think that's perfectly valid. So my next question, throughout your career and training, which experiences have been most formative in your musical journey? Well,
there are lots. I've been around for a long time. If I look back, and this is for any children and teenagers listening to this, one of the things that stood me in the greatest stead is an hour of scales practice at the piano every single morning from the age of about 11 until I was 19. And every single morning I got up at 5:50, had a shower and did my scales before I even thought about school. And I hated it at the time, especially getting up in the dark. But that was incredibly important to what I do now. Not just as a player, but also as the discipline that I learned at doing that. Partly because I was frightened of my piano teacher at the time, who was also a woman, believe it or not, far more frightening than any of the men I've ever met. So that was formative. My time in Toronto, being surrounded by really high-powered concert instrumentalists, and sort of having come from a small town in Canada where I was one of the best, to moving to Toronto, which is obviously the biggest city in Canada, where suddenly there were lots of people. That really made me realise, I suppose, where the bar is, And then I came to Cambridge, and the bar was even higher, and constantly aiming to be as good as, not only as good as I could be, but as good as I thought the bar was, which is probably unrealistic, but certainly has shaped everything that I do.
High aspirations then. Yeah. Thank you. In your role as a director of music, what influences your choices for repertoire? Mostly, I think of myself as a teacher, because I work in two educational establishments, Ely Cathedral, where I run the girl choristers, so they're at school, and then here in Cambridge, where I'm in charge of a university choir. And I think that when I choose music, I'm keen to make sure that the students and the children learn the entire repertoire, really, and they get a taste of everything. So that they learn about the music, they learn about performance practice issues, so we'll do plenty of early music, plenty of, this sort of bog standard Edwardian Victorian church music, and lots of contemporary music as well. I'm a big supporter of living composers. I do make an effort to include repertoire by female composers, both living and historic.
So, for example, this evening I'm going to live stream Compline for Ash Wednesday, and we're doing a piece by Lassus, who's obviously a very well-known Renaissance composer, but we're also doing a piece by Raffaella Victoria, she had two names, Aliotti, who was a nun in Renaissance Italy, whose music is absolutely fantastic and has only recently been sort of rediscovered because it's lain in a conventicle archive in Rome somewhere, and there's, people are starting to do some work on it. So I go out of my way to do that, but I also think it's important that actually all of those singers experience Brahms, Palestrina, Stanford, as well as Cecilia McDowell and James Macmillan and Howells and Palestrina and everybody, so that they get a real sense of what's out there. And when they leave, either school or university, and they decide, right, I'd like to specialize, I want to sing in an early music choir, then that's fine. But at least they know where Palestrina, Victoria, and indeed Aliotti fit into the kind of picture of the whole of the canon, I suppose, if you want to call it that.
Great, thank you. In an article for the Minerva Festival in 2019, you wrote that you wouldn't call yourself a composer. Could you tell us more about your relationship with self-identifying as a composer?
I do a lot of composition, but most of the time what I'm doing is filling a gap. I used to joke that I was the composer of liturgical necessity. So I suddenly realized there wasn't a setting of X, Y, or Z, and I really wanted it. So I looked everywhere, couldn't find one, so I had to write one myself. I remember the first thing that I wrote seriously, apart from, maybe the occasional descant or whatever, was a set of responses, praises and responses for upper voices, which were for the Ely girl choruses when they were very, very new. And I found that all of the upper voice responses, which we had to do, apart from just singing plain song, were really complicated and in 3 or 4 parts, and really almost apologizing for not having the tenors and basses present when we had to sing an upper voices service. And so I actually wrote them a very, very simple, straightforward set, which it's in 3 parts, but none of the parts is particularly challenging independently. And since the choir at that point was only about in its second year, it was important that they had stuff that they could sing really confidently. That was the first thing I had published. And I was surprised that it was obviously filling a gap, that it wasn't just me that needed that, because those have been quite popular and are sung in a lot of places. And since then, I've just carried on. More recently, just in the past year or two, I've actually sometimes started writing things because I actually just felt like it, rather than because there was something missing. Being a composer still doesn't come first in my list of things I do with my life, though. So I guess I am one, and I've had quite a few things published, and people have come to me and asked me to write things, and even sometimes paid me for it. But yeah, as I say, it's usually a sort of practical thing rather than sort of great inspiration.
I suppose it forms part of that portfolio career then.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I love about my career, especially the fact that I have 2 part-time jobs, which probably in any other part of the world, even in any other part of Cambridge, both of those jobs should be full-time jobs, but they aren't. But that allows me to have a freelance career as well. It also, though, allows me to experiment with my music on living singers, which is great, because there are plenty of composers who actually don't have that opportunity, and they send me copies and say, please will you sing this through so I can see how it works. And actually I can just put something in front of my singers. I did that last week, in fact. We were recording Evensong for a pre-recorded Evensong for Sunday, and all of the Selden students, we've only got 8 singers in residence this term, because obviously most of the students are studying remotely. But we were doing our socially distanced recording, but one of the conditions for the choir members that are around is that they have to be partaking in the university asymptomatic testing program. which they all are. Only we had two of them come back with what have now been shown to be false positive results. It meant on 3 hours' notice, I was down a soprano, a tenor, and my tenor is an organist as well. So I had to change all of the music at the last minute, which included writing a new introit for them and writing a set of canticles which were designed specifically for the slightly random group of singers I had who were not stuck in their rooms, annoyed that they weren't allowed out. And of course, they were allowed out 24 hours later when the second test came back negative. But, you know, that... as I said, I wrote that specifically for them, and then I gave it to them an hour later and said, sing this. And that is great from the composer's point of view, actually. I mean, I don't know what they think about it, but they seem to go down okay. You know, being able actually to kind of experiment on and with the music.
And my final question for you today, what advice would you give to young aspiring musicians for a successful future?
Get up every morning at 5:50 and practice scales on whatever your first instrument is. You've got to be disciplined. You've got to aim to be as good as you can be, and you've got to know where the bar is and aim to be that high. And you've got always to be striving to improve yourself as a player, as a conductor, whatever it is, as a singer, whatever it is that you do. You've got to be disciplined, and you've really got to love it. And I don't mean sort of love it. It's got to drive you. And I have to say, I think it's going to be harder for musicians post-COVID, and certainly in this country post-Brexit. As we know, it's a disaster. The whole issue about touring and stuff is potentially catastrophic for the industry, and especially for those coming through. So you've really got to know that the only thing in this world that you can do is be a musician, and not worry, especially for the first 10 years of your career, about trying to buy a house or trying to have children. I think probably, it's got to drive you, and you've got to be disciplined, especially whilst you are honing your craft.
Thank you for speaking with us today, Sarah, and I wish everyone a happy International Women's Day.
Thank you very much for having me.